Let me tell you about some things that can't be done. Things that are completely unrealistic, things that are totally off the wall. World peace, it cannot be done. People are never going to stop fighting with each other. Resolving the crisis of hunger at home and abroad, it can't be done. Giving away food creates dependency. Third world dictators stand in the way of charity, reaching those who need it most. 60 million people made in the image of God die every year of starvation and malnutrition, and there is nothing we can do about it because the problem is too big, too remote, too out of our hands for people like us to make any kind of meaningful difference. There are just some things that can't be done. There are just some things that are impossible. In our reading this morning, Jesus' disciples were confronted with an impossible situation. You see, it all started when Jesus heard the devastating news that John the Baptist had died. In his ministry, John had been a trailblazer for Jesus. He had crafted the model of ministry Jesus was following. Many of John's disciples had gone on to follow Jesus, who was seen as John's natural successor. But when John the Baptist was executed, Jesus wanted to mourn. He wanted to grieve for his cousin and friend. He also wanted to process the news and figure out what it meant for him and his followers. As he did so often in his ministry, he looked for a quiet place, a solitary place, where he could be alone with his thoughts and prayers. But the crowds kept pressing him, so he kept seeking more and more remote and isolated places until he finally gave up and just started teaching and healing them. As night fell, Jesus' disciples could sense the danger. Here was this big crowd out in a remote area. They needed food, and the disciples didn't have enough food to feed them. They barely had enough for themselves. So they reminded Jesus of the realities of the situation. They implored him to be realistic. They told him to do the sensible thing, to dismiss the crowd so they could go to the nearby villages and towns and buy themselves something to eat. But Jesus said, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. Now, what on earth did that mean? Was it another one of Jesus' cryptic sayings, another parable? How were they supposed to feed thousands of people? All they had was 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Jesus had to know that them finding food for all these people, that was impossible. It must have been some kind of object lesson. But then the next thing they knew, Jesus asked them to bring him the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. And then he made a big show of breaking the bread and giving thanks to God. And then the disciples handed out these table scraps, and before they knew it, everyone was fed. Everyone had more than enough. They collected 12 baskets full of leftovers. If the disciples had been feeling discouraged because of the news about John the Baptist, if they had been feeling like their ministry was doomed and their lives were over, if despair and the threat of violence was threatening to conquer their spirits, how must they have felt in this moment when Jesus did something impossible, when a true miracle unfolded before their eyes? This year, our church faces an impossible situation. If you attended the congregational meeting a few weeks ago, or if you've been reading the Salt Shaker, or if you're part of the leadership team, you've been poring over and stressing over the numbers, you know that we began the year with a $90,000 deficit in the church budget. Even as we enjoyed unprecedented success in a capital campaign that significantly reduced our mortgage, our normal church budget has struggled. And so we're stepping up our already robust efforts to save money, to reduce costs and find unexpected sources of revenue for ministry. By the grace of God and the generosity of our church, the deficit is now down to $45,000. And it will be reduced even further by the time we hold our next congregational meeting. This deficit is hard to process. It may seem like an impossible burden, but God has done impossible things before. In fact, God has an annoying habit of letting the problem grow, letting our despair and our frustration grow, letting us get to the point where we think we're at the end of our rope, and then we fall even further from that point, and then that's when God pulls out the miracle. There's a church in Minneapolis, Minnesota, Lake Nokomis Presbyterian Church. In 2008, they may have seen 30 people in worship on a good Sunday. The membership was getting older. There were literally no kids in worship on Sunday. And I don't mean a few kids, but literally none. The church had an endowment, but at their current rate of spending, the endowment would run out in 2 years, and the church would be forced to close. 2008, they had 30 people in worship on a good Sunday, and 2 years left. The Reverend Kara Root said the church was already past desperate. They went through the stage of desperation before I arrived. She noted that those few members who had stayed were hardy adventurers. They had been there through thick and thin, and she thought they might be ready to try something radical. So she proposed to them a completely new way of doing church. They would embrace a radical practice of Sabbath. They would take seriously God's command to honor the Sabbath day and make it holy, and in the midst of our culture of busyness, of striving, of achievement at all costs, they would rest. They would take a day off. They would unplug from the world. They would embrace the radical countercultural practice of stopping every once in a while. Specifically, here's what they do. And again, remember that in 2008, they were down to 30 worshipers. The church had 2 years left. So when I say, here's what they do, I'm saying here's how they have not only managed to live 8 more years than expected, but here's how they have come to thrive and grow as they have embraced a radical new thing. Here's what they do. They don't worship every Sunday. They worship on the first and third Sundays of the month. On the second and fourth weekends, they meet on Saturday nights for small group devotionals based on the previous week's reading. And then the next day, they practice Sabbath. They rest, they unplug, they sleep in and go to brunch. Sabbath is a deeply personal practice, and everyone has their own way of approaching it. But at Lake Nokomis, they have committed to Sabbath as a congregation. It's not just something they preach and teach about, it's part of the structure of their life together. As a result, their worship attendance has more than doubled. Young families and kids are now part of the church's life again, and they are financially secure enough to give away 10% of their budget each year in local missions. God can do impossible things. In our reading this morning, just after witnessing a miraculous meal, the disciples are on a boat in stormy waters. Jesus has finally gone off by himself. He's finally had a chance to pray and reflect. As the disciples sail to their next destination, Jesus simply walks by on the stormy water, having chosen a rather unorthodox method of transportation from one place to another. When he approaches the disciples, they think they're seeing a ghost, but Jesus assures them, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter asks Jesus to prove himself. He tells Jesus that he'll get out of the boat and join him on the water, and that if Jesus really is who he says he is, he'll help Peter walk on the water as well. Jesus assures him that this can be done. He asks Peter to step out of the boat and onto the water, and he does, and he walks. With the miraculous feeding of that large crowd fresh in his memory, he remembers that not only can Jesus do the impossible, but that Jesus can empower his disciples to do the impossible. Peter feels the thrill of the water beneath his feet, the amazement of doing an impossible thing, but eventually it becomes too much for him. He looks down. The spell of his belief is broken, and he begins to drown, but Jesus reaches out and saves him. I wonder if during the rest of his life, when Peter thought about that moment, I wonder if he lamented, if he regretted that he couldn't muster enough faith to keep walking on that water. As this year in the life of our church unfolds, Jesus is going to ask us to walk on the water. He's going to ask us to worship in new ways that speak to people who reside outside our walls, people who look at church and feel a vague curiosity, but have dismissed the idea that what's in here can transform their lives out there. Jesus is going to ask us to become evangelists, to follow him in the footsteps, to follow in the footsteps of Peter and Paul and other famous spreaders of the good news, to reach people in new ways, to build relationships that change lives with the power of God's love. Jesus is going to ask us to pray our hearts out. Jesus is going to ask us to change things we never thought of changing because we're committed to the transforming power of the gospel, and we serve the gospel before all other thoughts and all other interests. This year we have an opportunity. There is a sense of desperation in the air, a sense of beyond desperation, and that's something God can work with. Hand God a group of people who are terrified of the stormy seas, a group of people who are uncertain about the future, a group of people who see the realities and know that resolving the crisis is absolutely impossible. God can work with that. God does impossible things all the time, and God asks us to partner with him in the impossible, to do things that stretch our limits, to do things that seem impossible to us. Because they aren't impossible. Because we can walk on the water with Jesus if we'll step out of the boat and believe.